Hello, welcome to Happy Looming. This is Christy.
And I'm Janae.
And we're super excited to have you here with us today. Today, we are going to talk about loom gauge and the yarn sizes you can use with different kinds of looms. So, Janae, I want to know what your favorite gauge of loom to use and what yarn you like to use on it.
Oh gosh, that is such a loaded question, Christy, because I used to have kind of my favorites, but now I am like finding extreme love for a multitude of gauge sizes. I used to not really enjoy chunky knits as much, but in the last year, I love them. Like I would say that's my new kind of favorite because you can get things done so fast. The textures are just kind of really big and pop. And so right now, my favorite gauges are in the 5/8, 3/4, kind of those extra large gauges. But I would say that I also really, really love 1/2 inch, 7/16, 3/8, those kind of ranges. And honestly, I'm starting to love making socks in a smaller gauge, like the 1/4 inch and the 3/16.
So basically, you will use all of the gauges.
I want all of the gauges.
You want all the gauges. Okay,
I haven't made anything like super, super big, but I have been thinking about going with something that's more of like the 1 inch gauge. So really big. I've been looking at, I've been playing with some things, and I think that would be a really fun gauge to kind of play in too. So I don't want to pick favorites. I think for the project, it depends on the project. And then I would have a favorite gauge for that specific project.
I totally agree with that.
I'm going to pick a favorite.
So for me, if I'm making a blanket, I like chunky blankets. So I will use a number 6 yarn. I love the Bernay blanket yarn because it's easy to wash. If kids spill on it, you could just throw it in the washing machine. It doesn't shrink. It's great. And it's super soft. And really I prefer to use the 5/8 inch gauge with the Bernay blanket yarn. I know a lot of people use the 3/4 inch gauge. It works well on both. The 3/4 is a little bit wider. So when we're talking about gauge, I do want to explain this. A gauge on a loom is the space from the center of one peg to the center of the next peg. That's how we figure out the gauge. And
if you want to think about it too, if people might be like, what is gauge in the first place? Gauge is just basically a measurement, right? It's just between like how big it is, how far the yarn has to travel to make another stitch. So gauge is basically just a measurement of width.
It's a measurement of space, right? If we have 1 inch, if we're using a 1 inch ruler and using 1 inch of it, we're pretending that inch is broken up into 16 pieces, basically. And then we're using fractions so we would have 1/16 would be super tiny. The tiniest is just one little piece of it. And then we go up to an 1/8, which would be 2/16, but it can be broken down and reduced to 1/8. So the smallest looms we sell at CinDWood are the 3/16 gauge looms. And those are for like number 1 yarn. They're super fine, right? Those are for usually socks. Would you think of anything else people would make with the 3/16 besides socks?
3/16, I've seen anything made with those. Like you can literally make anything in that gauge. Gloves are phenomenal in that gauge. Hats, I've seen really intricate hats done in that gauge. Even sweaters, although I personally would never do that because I think I would go insane by the end of the like one sleeve. I would probably be nuts. But
so it's really good for color work probably and for patterning, like designs. If you're trying to make snowflakes or make pictures in your project, those tiny stitches. But my guess is somebody who likes needlework or like doing cross stitch would probably also enjoy working on a 3/16 inch gauge, the tiny intricate details.
They're going to be very, very tiny. Tiny little stitches, tiny little.
And it will take a long time to finish your project. Those are, they just take more time. So then as we get larger, 1/4 inch gauge is a common one. It's probably our most popular gauge for socks, for sock yarn. Sock yarn's usually 1 or 2. Is that correct?
Yeah, 1, 2, and
sometimes a 3.
3 is more like a DK weight or a sport weight or a light worsted. So you can get away with that for socks. That tends to be more like a slipper sock sometimes, but you can wear that size with shoes. It's just a little thicker, generally speaking.
So the next size we have at CinDWood is the 3/8. So we go from our 1/4 to 3/8, and 3/8 is great with what you were just talking about, the thicker sock yarn or the sport weight yarn or the baby yarn. The number 3s and even the lightweight number 4s work really well on those looms. Those are the ones I use for socks because the 1/4 and the 3/16, I'm like, oh, I don't have enough time. I'll never finish it. So
it did take a lot longer. So like my Skelly socks I made with the 1/4 inch gauge, and it did take a lot longer than my 3/8 inch socks. So once you go from a 1/4 inch sock and then you make a 3/8 inch sock, you're like, whoa, this is so fast. It's lightning fast.
Like, I could do this all day. This is great.
You could make thousands of socks. But it does make a difference. And with the 3/8, you're going to get, in my opinion, you're going to get more towards the slipper sock or something that's a little more decorative and not necessarily meant to be worn with shoes every day. Kind of around the house socks or
boots,
kind of
like something
cute,
that's really nice with boots.
Right. And a lot of times I will do 3/8 more as like a decorative sock, whereas a 1/4 inch sock would be more something that I would think of as someone might wear this with shoes on. So I don't want to have too much texture or decoration inside the shoe. But again, a 1/4 inch, when you're doing color work, you're going to have that extra thick sock because you'll have multiple strands inside of the sock. So it would make a really warm, nice winter boot sock as well. So it just kind of depends on
the project that you're doing.
But 3/8, you'll definitely be able to make a sock a lot faster than a cord.
Yeah, and it's a good beginner, good beginner sock gauge. Like if you've never made socks before and you're wanting to try socks, I often tell people 3/8 is a great introduction to socks because your wraps and turns are a little bit easier. It's they're not quite as close together. You can do your unit a little easier, at least for me. So that's kind of
definitely. And 3/8 gives you that nice kind of a little more dense fabric, but it's still a thin fabric. So it's not going to be super thick.
It's not going to be, I wouldn't consider it a slipper. I would definitely say it's a sock. Yes, with a number 3 weight.
If you're using it with a 3 weight yarn, you could even get away with a number 2 weight yarn, depending on the kind of stitches that you want. But with a 3 weight yarn, it's going to give you something that's way different if you've never gone down below a 1/2 inch, or even like a lot of people haven't gone below a 5/8 inch. So if you're going into a smaller gauge, this would be a good way to introduce yourself to smaller gauge. It will take longer to make whatever project you want to make, but you're going to have a more dense fabric and a thinner fabric. So it's really fun for socks, for gloves. It's really comfortable because you don't have a lot of bulk in
it works really well with the wools also. Like, cause I know there's a lot of people who will get like alpaca yarn or the wool yarns that are the lighter weight. But it's okay that they're lighter weight because they're so warm. When you have the finished project, you don't need it to be quite as dense as some of the acrylic yarns that maybe aren't quite as warm when they're in those smaller gauges, if that makes sense.
When you go to a natural fiber like that, then you do have a lot of properties that are inherent in the fiber itself that will make up for not having as bulky of a project. Yeah. I think that's so true. Okay, now 7/16 is not a gauge that we currently carry in all of our looms, but we have had people custom order them from CinDWood. And I know it's a gauge you like. 7/16 is probably one of my absolute favorite gauges. It is my number one go-to for worsted weight for the number 4 weight yarn. I think that those two combined, when you're using like traditional U-knit, just a standard knit, not the E-wrap, but a standard knit, I think they are just made for each other. They make that fabric kind of tighter and more snugged up closer together, so it's not super holey or open. And it's like my favorite for dishcloths, for hats, for gloves, scarves, like anything that I want to wear that I don't want to have open up too much.
You'll use the 7/16.
And I want to use a worsted weight yarn. 7/16.
Now I know you use 7/16 on knitting needles. Is there a loom company that currently carries a 7/16
Okay,
gauge?
7/16 is really hard to find in looms.
Okay.
I've had to kind of Frankenstein some looms together. So I've bought some looms, chopped them up, and made them smaller for hats and gloves. But they are out there.
Okay.
KB has one, and Cottage Looms had one. I'm not sure.
And you can custom them from us. We've had quite a few people
and custom order
the 7/16 from us, and you can get it in either our fine gauge pegs or our larger pegs. We let people choose which one they'd prefer, because it's kind of our bigger pegs are able to be made in the 7/16. But some people like the both, so
a little closer.
They're a little close together to get everything through. So that's kind of a fun one. And who knows, maybe we'll start making more of them if we get more people interested in that gauge.
Yeah. And then the 1/2 inch going up from the 7/16 is still wonderful. It is going to be a little more loose, but I still love my hats and my gloves, and even slipper socks in the 1/2 inch are phenomenal. With a worsted yarn are just really nice.
And I like the 1/2 inch because you can use the worsted weight, but you can use a number 5 on those to get like a really tight weave, and it doesn't for me, at least, when I'm using a number 5 on the 1/2 inch, it doesn't bind up. Like you can get, you can loom nicely with it, and it gets a really tight. I like to make hats with the number 5 on the 1/2 inch, and it's kind of it makes it extra thick and extra cozy for me when I'm using
and then that brings up a really good point too. So in knitting, what we talked about with gauge when it applies to the loom, the space between each peg, it also goes further into your project. So it will determine the size of your final project. And there are a bunch of factors that go into that. Not only the distance between the pegs, but the actual circumference of the pegs. So like the size of the peg, and then the size of your yarn, and then your personal knitting tension. So like how loose you knit, how tight you knit, all of those things will be a deciding factor in your finished project.
Yes. So that's an interesting fact, because the CinDWood fine gauge pegs have a smaller diameter than other companies. So KB's 3/8 inch looms and Cottage Looms, they have a different diameter than we do for our fine gauge looms. So the end product and the end stitches are a little bit different. And the patterns done on them come out slightly different depending on that diameter of your loom. Not better or worse, just slightly different.
Exactly. So when you're talking about 7/16 and 1/2 inch and using the different size pegs, that's going to determine a lot of things for your final outcome as well. So when you use this exact same yarn and the exact same distance, but you're using a different peg size, that peg size will also factor into the finished project. So when you're looking at something that you absolutely need to have a really nice fit, then like you were saying for the 1/2 inch, if you were to take a pattern that calls for worsted weight yarn and you go up to a bulky 5, then you might not need as many pegs to get the same outcome. And that's why gauge can be so confusing, but it's so fascinating at the same time, because then you can really start to play with what you're going to make and make it really work for the yarn that you want to use.
And when you understand gauge and yarn sizes and things, you can swatch easier. I think that swatching is something that people think is an advanced skill that you have to do, but really all you're doing is getting like 10 to 12 pegs and doing about 10 rows. If you do 10 by 10, I think that's a pretty good swatch size. Is that a good swatch size to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then
I usually go about 12 by 12.
Okay, 12 by 12.
Yeah, just because then you can generally get a really good read on how many stitches are.
Well, and especially if you're slip stitching your edges, right? So that gives you 10 that are actually coming down. And so that's a good reference. And then you're able to take your measuring tape and lay it across and say, okay, how many stitches am I getting per inch with this stitch and this yarn? And then if you know how big you need your project to be, you measure the circumference of your head or you measure somebody's hand for a glove, then you can multiply that. There is math involved, crazy math, but you can multiply
it's
how
just
many
a little
stitches.
bit, and you can get over it really quickly.
And you can get a calculator, right? You don't have to. You don't have to be able to do it in your head, but you can multiply that how many stitches per inch. Okay, and basically divide it by how many stitches you need, and you'll know how many pegs that you're trying to get. So
exactly.
I really encourage people to swatch. We even created a swatch set just recently so that they could have one in every gauge so they could swatch and figure out, okay, for this project, I actually want this gauge or this gauge. Because it's difficult when you create an entire project, you finish it, you take it off the loom, and it doesn't fit.
Exactly. And that's why it's just a common practice and extremely encouraged by most designers that you swatch because, excuse me, your gauge, your tension, your specific knitting tension will be different than mine because we have different hands. We do things different things. We hold our yarn tension differently. And the yarn that we use, it will vary between manufacturers. It will even vary within manufacturers. So you might get one colorway that is thicker than another colorway, but it's all labeled the exact same. So one of the very first things that I do before starting a pattern is I make a gauge on the loom that I'm going to use and with the yarn I want to use. And if you want to, you can make, depending on the project, that gauge can be part of the project, that swatch, or you just pull it out and then you start the project. But if you gauge with the specific yarn and the loom, then you'll know if it's going to work.
And I think that is something that I really am encouraging more and more people that call us. I'm like, make a swatch. It will totally help you. I know that here's a project I did. I made a cabled cowl, and the first time I made it on a 5/8 inch loom with a really chunky yarn, and it was really thick, and it turned out really pretty. But my mom wanted something that was the same style but wanted a lighter weight because she wanted to be able to wear it to church and different things and not necessarily have it be really warm. So I took the same pattern and I made it on a 1/2 inch loom with a Karen Simply Soft, which is a lightweight number 4. They say it's a number 4, but it's actually closer to a number 3 in my opinion. And
I think most people would agree with that.
And it came out more of like a lacy cowl. It wasn't super lacy, but definitely more airy, and it was just lovely, but it laid more like a fashionable cowl that you could wear to dress up your outfit rather than wearing out for a winter's day. And even though it was the same pattern and same number, and I used the same number of pegs. I took from the 5/8 loom, I was using the same number of pegs and just transferred it to a 1/2 inch loom, same number of pegs. And so that's an interesting thing that as we swatch and figure out, it's like, oh, okay, what can we do to because modifying patterns is fun. Like we don't always have a pattern and have everything that it calls for, right? Like we have a pattern sitting there and we're like, oh, I can't get a hold of that yarn, or I don't have that gauge loom, or I don't have that number of pegs, but I really want to make this pattern. So if it's a pattern that's a multiplication of 8, I can take another loom that's a multiplication of 8 and still make it, but it might turn out being a different size or a different look.
Or you might need less rows.
Or you might need less. Yeah. So it's going to look different. That's something we have to recognize. If I change anything in that pattern, my outcome will not be the same. Right.
So around the fall time, I have this set of skeleton, like skull patterns, I guess. Scullies is what I like to call them, skellies. And anyway, a lot of people wanted to make those patterns. And so most of the inquiries I would get is, can I make this with a bigger gauge loom? And so absolutely, yes, you can do that. You just need to make sure that you understand it's going to look vastly different. My 1-inch skull is going to be more like 3.5 inches tall and wide if you do it in a bigger gauge. And you'll want to significantly reduce the number of pegs that you do and the number of rounds that you do to make like the brim and things like that. So once you understand and once you start gauging more and counting your stitches and doing that kind of math, you may not be able to modify it now, but once you start doing things like that, it'll start kind of gelling in your brain that you'll understand how that works a little more. You'll understand that if you take two different kinds of yarn and you swatch them out on the same, loom, let's say you have a 1/2-inch loom and you take bulky yarn and then you take a number 3 yarn and you do, a 12 by 12 square swatch. You'll see the difference immediately. Mm-hmm. You'll understand the difference immediately. You'll be able to visualize exactly what we're talking about. And that will help you to start to understand, oh, okay, so if I don't have the yarn and the gauge loom that this pattern calls for, this is how it will affect the outcome. How can I tweak it so that it works with the yarn and the gauge that I have?
I think that's so important. And like also the different yarn you have will have different stretch to it. So some yarns have nylon in them. Some yarns are like cotton, doesn't stretch hardly at all. And so that's also another reason you want to swatch, because you might be making a pattern for somebody and in one yarn, it has a lot of stretch and it would easily stretch out to fit the person you're making for. But if you made it with a cotton yarn, it would be like way too small and wouldn't have that. So all
and
of
also
those
with
things.
cotton, it might shrink up. Yeah, once you wash
that's
it
a big thing too.
So it doesn't stretch, and then it also shrinks.
Yes.
And so, those are things that you'll understand as you start to make swatches and play with them. And one thing that I learned that I thought was extremely helpful is when you make your swatch, treat it like you would the outcome of your project. So if your project says to block your swatch. If your project says to wash it or it's washable, wash your swatch and see what happens once it's washed. See if it shrinks. See if it starts to felt. See what happens.
What's going to happen to it. Like, that's an example. Like if you're making a blanket for a newborn, guess what? That newborn is most likely going to spit up on it and have problems and it's going to get dirty. And you need a washable yarn that is going to hold up being washed over and over. Right.
Right.
And I think those are important things to think about when you're creating projects for people.
Absolutely.
And so that's
the yarn and the loom go hand in hand to make the finished project. And you just kind of have to understand how they're going to play together, how they're going to work together, and then what the finished project is going to end up being. And that's the way that you are successful when you make your projects, because you'll have an understanding because you've already swatched it, you've already played with it. You kind of know what your end result will end up being like.
Now, for those who are super new to even yarn, you're like, how would I even know what size? You're talking about all these sizes and all these things. Usually at the craft store, when you go to a store and you are looking at the rows of yarn, there's a ball band on the yarn. And when you turn that over, there will be usually a picture of a ball of yarn with a number on it. And generally, a 1 is called a fingering yarn. Okay. And we'll have a little number 1, and that's the smallest yarn. Number 2, do they call a 2 a sock yarn, or is it called something else? Know.
Here's the thing. There are tons of names for the different weights of yarn.
But if you look at the number, it goes up by increments of size and strands, correct?
Right. But and in other parts of the world, they don't have the number. They don't have the weight of number. So they might have something that's called a sock yarn or a fingering weight yarn or worsted or Aran weight. And that would be like a number 4 weight. So here in the States, we generally always will have that number on the yarn label.
And it goes from smallest to biggest, 1 to 7 so far in the United States. So your 7 is your largest, super bulky that you would use like on your zippy looms, on 1-inch looms. You could probably even use it on the 3/4 inch gauge if you wanted a super, super tight weave. But those are like the numbers. And that's how you would find out here in the States. Now, if you're ordering yarn from like a yarn dyer or from online from another country, like Janae's saying, they're going to use different language. So you might want to Google and say, okay, what weight does this mean? Or, or ask or send a question and say, what size is this about? What kind of, we're going to connect a link that shows about loom gauge, because a lot of yarn companies talk more about needle knitting than looms. And so if you do need to ask questions from a yarn company, we have a page that explains kind of what kind of needles you would use that compare with that gauge, so that if you had to ask questions, you could.
Yes, exactly.
So I think that's important. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my favorite gauge. My favorite gauge is 5/8 inch gauge. I love 5/8 inch gauge. The purple KK is my jam. I can make hats super fast on it. I love number 5 Charisma Loops and Threads yarn. That's my go-to like fast hat making yarn. It washes well. I make them for my family members. I can make gloves on them. I can make hats. And my favorite part is that on that loom, if I'm using a 1 strand of number 5 yarn, I feel like I can get really nice, like I can do cabling and I can do basket weave and different things. And the design work shows up better than on the 3/4 inch gauge. But it still is fast, and I can get them done quickly, and I don't have a lot of holes or air. It's not too airy. It's nice and connected. So that is honestly probably, I get more projects done a year in 5/8 inch gauge than any of the others. I always have other projects going in the other gauges, but they, because I really like 3/8, it just takes me so much longer to do it that when I'm making gifts, it's almost always on the 5/8.
5/8 is so fun. And this is what I was telling you earlier, is like, I have found a new love for the bulkier weight and the larger gauges. 5/8 is a brilliant gauge for, you take 2 strands of worsted, you take 3 strands of your DK or lightweight, and you can make anything with those. And it's fast. It is really fast. 5/8, like you said, the stitch definition usually shows up better. Depending on your yarn, if you're working with alpaca, goodbye stitch definition regardless, right? But,
good to know.
But but it's kind of like the 7/16 for a single strand of worsted for me. It's kind of like the difference there. You have like a nice dense fabric, and it's still stretchy. It still shows the stitches. They're not too tight, but they're not too loose. So it's really, really nice with your bulky weight yarns, and you can get projects done super fast, which is so satisfying.
It is satisfying. It's like, okay, I need to get this hat done. Like I made like 15 cable ear warmers for Christmas for like other employees that I work with and for family members. And I was like whipping out 2 or 3 a day and just getting them done in between. And that was it was so nice to be able to do that quickly and get them done, but they still looked really nice. And I knew it was going to be a product I'd be proud of. So that's kind of fun. I love what you said about using multiple strands of yarn. So explain why can I take 2 strands of a number 4 or 3 strands of number 3? And what does that even mean? How am I doing that?
Okay. So this is what I do a lot, because I tend to buy a lot of yarn. When I find a yarn that I like, I tend to buy a ton of it, right? Because I'm like, I'm going to make everything in this yarn. So a lot of times I'll want to make something similar as I would in my 3/8 inch gauge, but I want to do it in a 5/8. But I only have a size 3 yarn, or like a lightweight yarn. So I just have to triple strand it, and that will give me the same amount of yarn. So
do you have to use 3 balls at the same time?
No.
No.
So
okay.
So this is a really fun thing that I learned how to do. You can take one ball of yarn and you can loop it together. And there are videos that show how to do this, but you can just keep looping it and keep looping it. So you always have 3 strands in your hand, but you're just working from one ball. And so that's why I really like the number 3 weight yarn, held triple is what it's called. And working with a 5/8 inch gauge is just perfect.
I think I need to make a video of that because that is such a fun thing to do. I've watched some YouTube videos and tutorials showing how to do that, and it's brilliant.
Basically, I'm going to try to describe it. So you make a slip knot, and then you've got the loop. You know, the loop that you would tighten, it would get smaller, or you can pull on it and it gets bigger. So you take that loop and you go inside the loop and you grab the strand of working yarn and pull it through the loop and make another loop and just pull it till you have a really long loop. So now you've got 3 strands. So if you think of the loop as having 2 strands, and then the other side of the working yarn is your 3rd strand. So then you just knit with those 3 strands. When you get to the bottom where the loop is, you pull it through,
make it bigger again.
And you just keep pulling through that loop as you get down to it.
That is such a great way. And you can do that with any different yarns to create that thicker thing. Now, another thing I want to talk about, we're almost out of time, but another thing I wanted to talk about was the fact that if you're using a bigger gauge with finer yarn, what you're going to end up creating is laces. And so there's a lot of people that will use a 1/2 inch gauge loom with fingering yarn to create a very beautiful lacy shawl. Or you might use a 5/8 inch gauge loom with a number 3 yarn, just 1 strand, to make a lace cowl or different things. But it's creating those eyelets, and those laces work really well when you have a little bit of the gauge with a larger gauge with a smaller yarn is what will help create that. And you usually do have to block those projects so that the lace is more visible and you can see that. But
so when you're looking at gauge and you see the recommendations, they're usually like, well, this is recommended because it's the basics starting point. It's where you kind of start off with your basic knit stitch, but then there are no rules when it comes to knitting. And that's the beauty of it. You can make what you want to make. You can make that fabric how you want to make. If you want a light, airy fabric, then using a smaller weight yarn on a larger gauge will give you those results. If you want something that's a really dense fabric, then using a thicker weight yarn on a smaller gauge will give you that result. So once you learn the basics, then you can really start to play and have fun. And this is where swatching is really fun. Like I said, if you take that same yarn and you swatch it on a bunch of different looms and different gauges, and you can see the result. You can see.
Yeah. I mean, I know there's some people who will use a number 5 yarn on a 1/4 inch loom, which I just go, oh my goodness, that would bind up way too tight for me. That would be really hard for me to use. But I know Robin Runtus often makes some of her really thick hats that way. And she has no problem doing a thicker yarn on that. So there really isn't rules. You just have to find what works for you and your tension and the way you knit and what your end result that you're going for. And it's the opportunities and ideas are endless, right?
Exactly. And it's so much fun once you start playing with it. So don't be afraid to swatch out and play with gauge and really learn what your yarn and your looms are doing. And you'll have a greater understanding for what we're talking about here, what this whole gauge
what is this?
And why yarn works differently on different looms and different sizes of pegs and things like that.
So we're so glad you joined us today. It was so fun to learn more and talk about loom gauges and yarn sizes, and I hope you'll join us next time. Happy looming!
Bye. Happy looming!